Bienvenue. Welcome to the Presidential Invited Address of the Statistical Society of Canada. My name is Bruce Smith and I'm the current president of the Society. The Presidential Address opens the annual SSC conference, which this year was scheduled to begin today at Carleton University. In lieu of meeting face-to-face, I'm pleased that you're able to join us for this presentation. We're delighted to have David Donoho giving the Presidential Address this year. David did his undergraduate degree at Princeton with John Tukey as his advisor and his PhD at Harvard under the supervision of Peter Huber. After several years on faculty at UC Berkeley, David moved to Stanford, where he's professor of statistics, and Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor in the Humanities and Sciences. David's research interests include statistical inference, harmonic analysis, signal processing, and data visualization. He has worked extensively on methods for construction of low-dimensional representations of high-dimensional functions. His many contributions range from the theoretical to the applied. I'll mention just a few. Many of you will know of David's work in the 1990s on shrinkage of empirical wavelet coefficients, allowing, for example, for optimal reconstruction of functions corrupted with additive noise and for optimal density estimation. In the mid-2000s, David and colleagues developed a technique which they termed compressed sensing, in which, under certain conditions, a signal can be accurately reconstructed from sparse measurements. This has had dramatic impact. It's being incorporated into modern MRI imaging equipment, reducing the time to do an MRI by roughly tenfold. On a completely different note, David recently wrote a paper entitled 50 Years of Data Science, in which he persuasively argues for data science as a new discipline. This paper has had tremendous influence on the development of data science programs and curricula. David's work in statistics, mathematics, and more broadly has been recognized through receipt of a number of honors. I mentioned just a few. He received a MacArthur Fellowship in 1991. He was the winner of the COPS President's Award in 1994. He was awarded the Norbert Wiener Prize for Outstanding Contribution to Applied Mathematics in 2010, the Shaw Prize in Mathematics for Outstanding Contributions to Academic and Scientific Research or Applications, which is sometimes referred to as the Nobel Prize of the East, in 2013, and the Gauss Prize for Outstanding Mathematical Contributions that have found significant applications outside of mathematics in 2018. Today, David will speak to us about some very recent work. During the past several months, we've all been adversely affected in one way or another by the COVID-19 crisis, and it's clear that before society can safely return to any sort of normalcy, we need a dramatic increase in testing. David's talk today focuses on this issue. David, please proceed.
Bienvenue les francophones. Malheureusement, je n'aurai pas la possibilité de parler en français toute cette adresse. Welcome everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. The lecture that I'm about to present, it is on very recent work. I want to stress that I'm really describing the work of other people here. As you'll see, this is a project that our whole civilization is embarking on, and there's no way that it's anything like one person's work, but I will be able to spotlight a number of interesting researchers' contributions. At the beginning and at the end of the talk, you can see pointers to the talk materials which are available should that be helpful to you. So we all know that a little more than 2 months ago, there was a fairly large movement to say thank you to healthcare workers. We see here in the local news in Ontario, an effort by the registered nurses to have us thank them for all of their work. And in fact, all of Canada responded. So it's possible to go online and see very moving and striking videos of Canadians flowing forth with emotion to thank the healthcare workers who have come at risk in this recent COVID pandemic. And of course, it's not only Canada. You can see that Her Majesty the Queen here is addressing her nation and the Commonwealth and pointing to not just the frontline healthcare workers, but everyone who's playing an essential role. So today, this is a theme for my talk as well. I plan to say thank you as well, but it will take a little bit of explaining. First thing is that unfortunately, this pandemic is all too similar to the pandemics that have plagued the human race for really thousands of years. In this drawing, the angel of death in Egypt is just outside of the household that's hunkering down, trying to avoid the plague that was coming in those days. And that was 3,000 years ago, but here we have just say 500 or 600 years ago, a depiction of the Black Death and its effects in Europe. One thing that you see here is that in addition to hunkering down, someone has gone out to fetch some goods and is returning wearing a mask. So when they went out, they were masked, and then when they came back, they brought necessary things. The behaviors we're seeing here of hunkering down and wearing masks are all too much similar to the way the world is today. In a certain sense, nothing is really different about this particular moment than things that have been happening for thousands of years, except really for one thing. The main thing that we have today that we're able to rely on and perhaps help us get out of the tough spot that we're in is testing. You can see here that we've been able to do quite a few tests per 1,000 people in a variety of different countries. Canada is there in red. You can see it pointed to on the right. So we've reached the point where maybe 4 or 5% of the population has been tested for COVID-19. And that's actually, quite a lot of tests to do. And it's quite impressive that, a whole country would be able to gear up to do that many tests. But it's only 4% of the population, and that's on a one-time basis. Now, there's interest on the part of economists to opening up the economy again and getting us all going again. In fact, the US economy and perhaps the Canadian economy as well have gone through really historic declines in economic output. And there are many individuals in the United States anyway who live paycheck to paycheck. And they don't have a paycheck right now if they're working in any kind of job that involves face-to-face contact. So we have a very high unemployment rate in the United States. It's at the level that's only been seen in the Great Depression 80 years ago. Economists would like to get us back at work. And Paul Romer is a very eminent economist. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And he's been the chief economist of the World Bank. So he's very highly respected. In recent weeks, he's dedicated himself to the cause of getting a major crash effort to do nationwide coronavirus testing. So if we look at the Wikipedia article on COVID-19 testing, we'll see these passages. Paul Romer believes that the US already has the technical capacity to scale up to 20 million tests per day, which is his estimate as to the number that will be necessary to remobilize the economy. He estimates this amount of testing would require $100 billion, and then goes on to say it doesn't have to be a perfect test. And basically what he's looking for is to test 7% of the population every day with a test that has a 20% false negative rate and a 1% false positive rate. The average person would be tested roughly every 2 weeks, and those who tested positive would go into quarantine. First of all, as a statistician, I find this whole discussion pretty amazing. Here we have first importance being attached to an issue of false negative and false positive rate. Secondly, we have ideas that are completely second nature and standard for statisticians to be discussing, dominating the national discussion. So we should pay attention, and that's why we're discussing this issue today. But secondly, it points out the fact that tests are absolutely essential. The ability to test for COVID-19 is something that we're all depending on to get the economy going again, and particularly those who live paycheck to paycheck. So we need maybe a different round of things to be thought of, at least when we're in an intellectual gathering such as this one. How about thanks to the scientists and technologists who created tests, the government agencies that got this going so quickly, the business and government organizations that manufacture the test kits so quickly, and then all the labs and health workers who are administering the tests. But in my opinion, I'd like to extend this. I'd like to thank the scientists and technologists who invented the underlying technologies that are being used here long ago. And that includes statisticians who've been working on disease testing for decades, and also on rapid scale-up of testing for decades, as I will show. Finally, there's been an exuberant new movement of citizen scientists who have proposed adaptations to allow a rapid scale-up of testing during the crisis. Thanks to all of these people. So in my presentation today, I'm thinking of the whole thing as an offering of thanks. And the way I'm offering thanks today is to review, first of all, the exploding literature on COVID-19 testing on medRxiv, a totally new development. Secondly, I'll have to explain some things to you who I assume are not experts in this, how modern COVID-19 tests work, and some of the ins and outs of reverse transcription, quantitative polymerase chain reaction tests. Then I will talk about ideas that have been developed by statisticians, engineers, applied mathematicians on how to expand the reach of the testing capacity that we have. So let's start talking about the COVID-19 medRxiv explosion. You know, to mathematical scientists, statisticians, mathematical physicists, mathematicians, we've had arXiv for almost 30 years where we could post preprints of our papers, and it just became second nature to us that when we wrote something that we thought other people would want to see quickly, we would just put it on arXiv. And I've put many papers on arXiv, and I'm sure many people in the audience have put many also. Now, in the medical sciences, this was never a thing. It was always the case that people said in those fields, well, it has to be peer reviewed, and you know, they would wait nervously for referees to pass judgment on their papers. However, things changed just last year. In 2019, Cold Spring Harbor Labs, which ran bioarchive, which is quite similar to the mathematical sciences archive, and they expanded their reach into medRxiv, which allowed people in the medical sciences to post articles. So it could have been possibly years and years before people in the medical sciences started to accept that idea. However, what actually happened is that COVID-19 came along. As you can see, as of yesterday, there were 4,500 or so articles on medRxiv and bioarchive together on either COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. And you can, look at the most recent ones that have just come in, and you can look at, the topics and see the diversity of things. It's been so that in recent weeks, there are maybe 100 to 150 submissions per day. And, tongue in cheek, we can plot how many COVID cases as another indicator of the progress of this disease. And we see they're going in a roughly correlated way. Obviously, correlation does not imply causation. Writing about this does not cause it. Now, the explosion of literature on medRxiv corresponds to an explosion of human effort to do the research behind that literature and to get a lot of information out very rapidly. So we start to see rhetoric that the world has changed. And you can go online and pretty much everywhere you look, you'll see that the economy has changed as Amazon has killed retail, and that COVID-19 has just cemented the process, and on and on and on and on. Okay, but this is the world has changed as in the world of intellectual life, the world of biological sciences, the world of medical science. So here are some articles that I'm spotlighting that say that coronavirus is changing science, the process of scientific communication, and the speed at which science advances. Another article talking about how COVID-19 has prompted the rise of a global collective intelligence, where there's a huge number of researchers kind of working in a hive mind to attack this dread illness. Now, in my talk today, I've been able to draw on a lot of literature on medRxiv. And so I've highlighted here just a number of the locations of institutions where there's papers on medRxiv that have helped me in putting this talk together. And so you can see that it's truly a global effort. The Commonwealth certainly plays its role and has some crucial contributions. Two of them will be spotlighted. And then in addition, there's a lot of papers from Germany and Europe in general, but you also see things from Southeast Asia. Now, in going through this explosion of new knowledge on medRxiv, there's a series of claims made in many, many articles, and I'll just spotlight one made by a team from Munich and University of Vienna. They make the following claim. We can expand testing in the following way. By using only 141,000 test kits, we could actually test the disease state of all 1.47 million inhabitants of Munich, Germany. Or if we had as many as 1 million test kits, we would determine the disease state of 6.69 million inhabitants of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Of course, these claims are under certain conditions being true, which we will discuss. Now, the gains that are claimed here are additive to any other scaling up. So if Paul Romer gets even a fraction of his money, he will scale up to some degree, not by these particular techniques, but then the techniques that I'll be talking about in this talk will enhance a further scale up, which is on top of whatever Romer's political organization is able to achieve. And in particular, if Romer gets no resources, these gains can still be brought into play. I do want to say, and this will be clear as we go along, that it's only under certain conditions that this can work. However, as we'll explain, those conditions seem like they apply. So here's a number of papers in medRxiv that I've relied upon. And you know, the contributions to medRxiv have been really all over the place, both in terms of, you know, literally what part of the world they come from, but also in terms of what part of the professional space they come from. So some of these papers are associated with major medical centers, major medical research teams. Others are associated with, you know, applied mathematics research teams or physics research teams. And then there's even one here that I'm spotlighting because I, you know, found to be well written and very clear and insightful. It's written by a father-son team where the father's a retired physicist at MIT and the son recently graduated as a Harvard undergraduate. So people are making contributions from really all over, and some of these papers I'm going to spotlight in much more detail. In this particular display, I've arrayed the papers in order that they were first posted on arXiv. So in the upper left, that was towards the end of March. And then as we move across, it's towards early April, later in April, then on the lower row, later and later into April. And apparently, you know, the order of events matters because individual papers influenced others and so on. So part of the knowledge explosion here is that, you know, some of these papers got out there and were cited by others, etc. Now, what I'm hoping to do is to explain these claims that we can expand testing rapidly by going into the details of what they're suggesting to do. But as you can already see from the titles in all of these articles, pooling is an important word here, or group testing. And so basically, there's been this mass movement on medRxiv spontaneously over the last couple of months of people suggesting that we do pooling or group testing, and that this is a way to expand testing beyond the capacity that we have, which is ramping up, but not ramping up to the level of being able to test several % of the population per day. Now, pooling is an old topic in statistics. There's an article in the Annals of Mathematical Statistics, 1943, by Robert Dorfman, The Detection of Defective Members of Large Populations. In this article, he proposes, look, if you've got a disease of low prevalence, then why don't you just combine the blood from all of those individuals and do one test to begin with? And if you get a negative result, then you know nobody has the problem. And so you only had to do one test and you've saved on test kits. And then he did a careful analysis based on properties of the binomial distribution, which say that for a given prevalence rate, there's a certain optimal group size of how many patients' blood to combine. And then there'll be a certain relative testing cost because some fraction of the time you're going to get a positive result. And then he suggests to retest and test everybody. So he gets essentially the expected total number of tests, and he documents the savings. And in graphical form, we can see that if the prevalence rate is, say, 1%, then it's possible to reduce the amount of total testing that you do by a factor of 5. And even if it's 10%, you can reduce the amount of testing that you do by a factor, well, at least you can save 40% of your effort. So this has been out there in statistics as a known idea associated with blood tests, which in a sense is what this is. Even if it's with nasal swabs, we're taking samples from patients. And so the idea of pooling is definitely out there. And of course, this is not the only article that's ever been in the history of statistics. No, there's been hundreds, and we'll see more. So, for example, here's an article from during the HIV epidemic where HIV antibody tests had just become available in the early 90s. And these authors from Harvard School of Public Health pointed out that you can you can use a limited number of test kits in a strategic way, and they wanted to extend on what Dorfman did into a way that would make more sense. So in their study, they considered a test where you pool together 15 different blood samples, you evaluate them for antibodies. If it's all negative, fine. If not, you divide them into 2 groups and then recurse. And after some number of evaluations of this kind, you will then have gone through the situation of narrowing things down to the point that you're even doing individual blood tests. Now, a key element in this analysis was that they did not assume that these tests are perfect. They assumed that there could be a, false alarm rate, there could be a misdetection rate, and they pointed out that this method is somewhat better than Dorfman's in those circumstances because of the repeated aspect of the testing. So if there's a false alarm, you can find out that it was a false alarm because of the multiple stages that are involved, etc. So they looked at the number of tests needed and in an environment where there would be 15 tests associated with 15 patients. They considered Dorfman's procedure, which is the dashed line, and then their new procedure is the solid line down here, and it does considerably fewer tests than Dorfman's procedure, maybe in the extreme of very low prevalence, half as many. So coming out of this development, which is in the statistics literature, the first paper was Annals of MathStat. The second one that I spotlighted was JASA. So what statisticians knew and mathematical scientists generally, if the prevalence is low, you can evaluate the disease status of N people with fewer than N test kits. Now, you need low prevalence for this idea to have some traction, but we are in the correct range for this. In Romer's effort, he actually did a fair number of forays into this issue, and he thinks that the highest we'll ever see is maybe 8% of the population having an infection, and then the percentage that would be infected at any given time is going to gradually decline from there. So we're actually in the range where this classical theory would seem to apply. Now that's great, because in the hundreds of articles that are out there, then of course there are many, many interesting elaborations. It's not just the recursive dyadic partitioning idea that you saw in the JASA paper, but there are many other interesting ideas. And we've been preparing for this for generations, in a sense, and writing all of those papers. We've been very insightful and ahead of the curve. There's just one thing, which is we don't know yet, because I haven't spoken to you about it. We don't know yet if the abstract problem statement really matches COVID-19 testing. I haven't told you anything about how COVID-19 testing works. And so it's conceivable that there's all this, nice abstract treatment that shows you can save a lot of effort and so on, but that there's some fatal flaw in the abstraction that makes it not really be relevant to this disease. So because of that, we need to discuss viral testing in science, and you've just got to understand some basics of reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction viral testing. It's the gold standard for COVID-19 testing. There may be other tests developing, but this one has been available since mid-January of 2020, where it was formulated by Charité Hospital in Berlin. It was vetted by the CDC and has had an emergency use authorization since March. In the US, the major lab players like Quest and LabCorp all offer this, and it's been used hundreds of thousands of times. It's not just the gold standard for COVID-19. In fact, it's the gold standard for the whole series of epidemic viruses that you're all familiar with. One reason is that the hardware for this is widely available. Another is the incredible sensitivity that it has. The experiment in principle detects anything up down to about just 10 particles, virus particles in a blood sample. Moreover, when it detects, there's no chance really of mistaken identity here, because it's detecting a very specific RNA sequence, something that might be 100 or 200 aminos long, and there's just no realistic chance that it would be wrong if it calls a detection. You might miss it if you do a nasal swab that doesn't touch the right area of the nose, but if you get it, you got it. Now, I have to explain a little bit of the science, but polymerase chain reaction is a tool that lets you take a chunk of DNA that you're looking for and transform the sample that it's in so that there's more and more and more of that DNA, so that even if it's just a tiny amount to begin with, there's eventually a huge amount. It goes through a set of stages called cycles. So in these cycles, you first come close to boiling the DNA, causing it to melt, and then you cool off, and then you warm up a little bit. And during this process, the DNA melts and splits into two. And then DNA primer, if it finds what it's looking for, this is keyed to a very specific sequence, and if it finds it after melt, then it's going to bind onto there. And then all the other positions are going to be taken up by raw materials that are supplied. You do this once, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. And in each generation of heating up and cooling and heating up and cooling, you get approximately a doubling of the substance you're looking for. Now, that wouldn't really help you because you wouldn't know that you had produced all this doubling, except that the gadget that you're using to find the sequence you're looking for is specially kitted out. It's got a fluorescent piece at one end. And so when it finds what it's looking for, it's then got a little fluorophore attached to that piece of DNA. And so to the extent that you find the DNA you're looking for in these strands, you have a lot of strands of DNA that are now labeled with the fluorophores. Then in order, well, sorry, let me just go back here. Then finally, there's a special reaction with something called TACMAN that liberates the fluorophore. It fluoresces and you see it. And so at the end of the day, you can liberate those fluorophores, and that allows you to measure how much stuff you have created. The ability to do that is a story in itself. In Mushroom Springs in Yellowstone National Park, very hot springs, and there's some bacteria that through the wonders of evolution learn to live in very, very hot water, and they produce a substance which yields up TACMAN polymerase, which is the substance that's able to go in and liberate those fluorophores and let us see whether this doubling cross generations has actually occurred. Now that's all at the level of DNA. For virus, we have to first take the viral RNA, apply reverse transcription, get the complementary DNA, and then we apply this process to it. And so hence the name RT-PCR is telling us that it's a way of measuring the presence of viral RNA. So there's RT-qPCR devices to do this. The gadget over on the right is the thing that does the thermocycling, and then there's some computer output and some plots show up. And here's a plot in a laboratory. What's going along the x-axis is an index of the cycling. Remember, we again and again and again heat and cool and heat and cool. So if we're at 16, that means we've done this 16 times. If we're at 30, we've done it 30 times. On the vertical axis is the fluorescence, and then there's a threshold marked here. And once the fluorescence is above threshold, we say that we've got a detection. Now in this plot, we've done a run with a sample where there's a lot of virus. Then we did a new set of runs where there's 1/10 as much virus and 1/10 as much and 1/10 as much and so on. And so we start out with a lot of virus, and down here there's just a handful of virus, and it still continues to work. But what the cost is that the virus becomes evident later because you have to go through more cycles of doubling before you reach threshold. Okay, so in light of what I've told you about this, you can now understand some of the papers that are out there on medRxiv. Here's a paper from University of Nebraska Medical Center, and actually one of the co-authors is for the Department of Statistics, University of Nebraska. In this paper, they pooled specimens into pools of 5, and they showed that they can perfectly well detect and that pools of 5 are perfectly good to work with. And their conclusion is, as long as the incidence rate is 10% or less, this is a great technology and it will really increase testing capability. A key thing that they do here is present data showing you what you might expect. Is that if you have a specimen and you don't pool it, you cross the threshold at an earlier cycle than if it's part of a pool pooled with a bunch of things that are not infected, because you're just diluting it, and when you dilute it, there's a lower density, you have to go through more doublings. And so they show that at the pooling they recommend, you have to go through some number of extra doublings in order to get to threshold. Another very interesting paper that came out on medRxiv, this was on March 26th, made a much stronger claim. This was from a team at in Israel at the Rambam Hospital and Technion campus of Israel Institute of Technology. And they claim that a single positive sample can be detected in pools of up to 32. So it's okay to pool up to 32 at once. So then, this is not an issue that had to occur to Dorfman or many of the statisticians. There's only so much you can pool things before the detection technology breaks down, but the claim here is you can pool quite a lot, and so many of the results that we might be interested in could apply. They show here something that should remind us of the plot that I showed you on the RT-PCR machine. Here's just a regular sample, and you can see crossing threshold at about 28 cycles. If we pool it with one negative sample, now we've diluted with 50%, it takes a little longer. And if we pool it with 3, it takes a little longer because we have to go through more doublings. We have less total virus to begin with because of dilution. We go through more doublings. In every case, we still get up to threshold. The key thing is that the FDA in the EUA says you gotta cross 300 and you gotta do it by cycle 40. And so the amount of pooling that you're allowed to do is gonna be based on, can you get up to this threshold by 40? And so the last one that can do it is at 63. Another thing that I found mind-blowing is in this article is that they gave a plot that shows all the patients at this hospital in early March. They show again the threshold, and they show the fluorescence that was observed for all the ones who had the disease and then all the ones who didn't have the disease. And so you can see here, for example, that the ones who don't have the disease don't cross, and the ones who do have the disease do cross. And you get an idea that there are some patients with a lot more virus than other patients, and it takes longer. So this is extremely instructive to understanding what the issues are in this technology. Okay, so the latest set of developments is that we're trying to go significantly beyond the ideas of Dorfman or the ideas of the dyadic partitioning that was used in the HIV crisis. And what we would like to do is have one round only pooling. In the Dorfman approach, there's potentially 2 rounds. You have an initial screening round to see if there are any samples, any positive samples, and then you have to test everybody. So there's a second round, which is just as very time consuming. the total delay that's caused in the dyadic partitioning is even larger because you go through a series of rounds after rounds after rounds, potentially, if there are some positive samples as you successively narrow the field to where are those positive cases. The thing that would be the most practical is to have a one round only pooling where we just do a bunch of tests. We use an assay array, like there's a tray of 96 different assays that we put in. There's 96 different blood samples, and we just do them all at once, and then we see what comes out. And so that's a high throughput approach. We make a whole bunch of measurements. It's not a sequential approach, etc. Now, in order to understand the issues there, I'm going to repackage a little bit of what's been said in a language that some statisticians may find more helpful. So let's say that there's capital N individuals and that their viral loads are recorded in a vector. Of course, we don't necessarily know those numbers. This is a modeling assumption. It's unknown parameters. And we're conceiving of pooling into capital T test pools, each of some given size. What's going to come out of testing is for each of those test pools, we're going to know whether the fluorescence by cycle 39, which is what the FDA is saying we have to use, has that fluorescence cross 300 at cycle 39. Now that's a binary array. We either got or didn't get in each test pool. Let's think of this now as data which is explainable by a generalized linear model. So then the YTs would be Bernoulli with some link function associated with a linear predictor. And here the linear predictor is going to be linear in the viral load of all the members of that pool. If we combine all those linear predictors of the different tests into a vector, then there's an underlying linear system hiding under this generalized linear model. So we know this. We know that associated with a generalized linear model and inside of it, somewhere there's a linear system hiding, and that by methods like weighted least squares, we can solve generalized linear models. So this much is standard statistics. Each of us, I would imagine, has used it or taught it or thought about it many times. Now, if I have a linear system that says the linear predictor is linear in the viral load, then I'm interested in the design matrix, which is just really a simple indicator of I chose as a design issue which individuals serve in which test pool. And, I could discuss properties of this design matrix. Two very important ones would be the row weight and the column weight. The row weight is what's the maximum number of individuals in a pool, and the column weight is what's the maximum number of pools that an individual belongs to. And we might have design constraints on either of these in such a way that, we don't want to have a row weight that's too high, or we don't want to have a column weight that's too high based on the science of what we're trying to do. Now, the situation that we're in is that we have a linear system, and in some sense, the data that we have is about the linear predictor eta. What we don't have is the viral load and the facts about that. That's what we want to infer. If the vector X is sparse with relatively few non-zeros, then we can get away with fewer tests than individuals. Namely, we can solve an underdetermined system of equations even though we have, fewer equations than unknowns, provided in some sense the number of non-zeros in the unknown is small. And there are extensive examples of this. Combinatorial group testing is one. There's a field called sparse recovery in signal processing. There's a field called compressed sensing, which Bruce Smith mentioned in his introduction. And so there's a lot of culture in the mathematical sciences that says you can actually get away with this. Okay, so that inspires a variety of one round only pooling algorithms. One of them you can see in this meta-archive paper of Chantal and collaborators that comes from Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba, and also a collaborator is at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. And they describe their idea that they create 48 pools out of 384 patients. And those pools then create 48 vials of blood, which are loaded into a tray, which is then automatically processed. Everything in the tray is processed, and you get 48 different PCR results. And then you process by their so-called decoding algorithm, and it tells you exactly what it thinks are the individuals there. So you get, with 48 test kits, you get results on 384 patients, and it's all at one go, all in one single stage. And they give some experimental results showing that when there, really only a small number of positives, like around 1% or 2%, that this really works, and that the false positives and false negatives are under control. And, you should go to the paper in order to read more about it. If you look in their references, you'll see that they make prominent reference of books on combinatorial group testing. Frank Wong is a well-known researcher, used to be at Bell Labs, is published in JASA and other statistics journals, things about group testing. And definitely group testing has had many uses in biological processing. There's even a book that he's written on DNA sequencing. Now, another one round only method is called tapestry, and this is from a team out of IIT Bombay and individuals in Bangalore and some people at Harvard. So this is a idea that's inspired by this technology of compressed sensing. So that's the connection to how I came to know about it. But of course, it's an amazing, amazing collection of work that's far beyond anything I could ever imagine. Among other things, they create an Android application which allows you to do this smart testing data analysis on your phone, and also to do the design problem on your phone. And so it guides you through everything that you need to do in order to set up the system and analyze the data and so on. Method is called tapestry. So, here's some of their eye candy. As we've described, there's N individuals, and each individual participates in their system in up to 3 pools. And then there's a limited number, I think 7 individuals in any one pool, and then associated with each pool is a test result. The way they measure the test result is how many cycles of PCR were needed in order to get to threshold. And they're based on that. So in particular, if it takes more than 40 cycles, then we infer there really isn't any disease in any of that blood. Whereas if it's 20 cycles, there's a lot of virus in that blood. The point of their decoding is that it takes those test pools and tells you which individuals are infected. And they do studies on these two particular matrices where they're going from 40 patients down to 16 tests, or from 60 patients down to 24 tests. You can see here the row weight and column weight that I've spoken about. They compare themselves to 2-round Dorfman, and they do 1 round. So for example, if the prevalence is 1%, they can test 961 patients in 1 round of 93, whereas Dorfman would take 2 rounds and 197 tests on average. At higher levels of prevalence, they still have an advantage over Dorfman, although it's less. You can look at their references and you can see that, you know, they point to some of the papers that I pointed to earlier. Here's the paper on essentially the science of the pooling in RT-qPCR that you can dilute up to 64. Here's the paper from the University of Nebraska team, so on. But then they point to things that are more related to things that I know, and you know, and work by competitive teams. And you see they point to Dorfman. I'll just point to, they find it inspiring to look at things that people have been doing in compressed sensing. And a key thing which I didn't mention is that in solving these underdetermined equations, you need to use something like an L1 penalization GLM. And of course, so then they're referring to well-known Canadian statistician and my colleague at Stanford, Rob Tibshirani. So we're at the conclusion. Mathematics and statistics anticipated the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been working on how to leverage testing facilities to get more patients evaluated, and we've been doing it for generations. Right now, economists, in face of an unprecedented economic crisis, are urging really massive COVID-19 testing, costing upwards of $100 billion. At the same time, the COVID-19 prevalence is compatible with doing pooling, and pooling is compatible with high performance use of PCR detection for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. If you go out right now on medRxiv, you can find discussions of pooling designs and decoding algorithms out there right now. Pooling, if it were done, would reduce the cost of that massive COVID-19 testing dramatically. As we've seen, if the prevalence is below 10%, we ought to be able to not have to pay $100 billion for this, but maybe more like $60 billion. If the prevalence stays even lower than that, then we have comparable savings that continue from, as you can see from earlier parts of the talk. So the talk materials are available online at the tiny URL that I point to. And I want to say there's a lot of people's work that, you know, they've dedicated their careers to topics like this, which I certainly have not. And there's no way that I can do justice to all that they've been doing. But as an example, I would encourage you to go look at Chris Builder's webpage at chrisbuilder.com/group testing, where he has lots and lots of information about group testing, you know, many papers that he's written, but also a Shiny app that helps you design group testing correctly. He was one of the co-authors in the University of Nebraska study that I spoke about earlier. And his online resources at this link were exactly used in that study. There are many other authors who did things that go beyond everything that I've discussed here, and I relied on to inform myself about it, but just couldn't squeeze it in the time that I had today. But I really encourage you to go look at their work. In addition to the talk materials, which are, the slides that you're looking at, there's also some individual papers that are referred to and a few papers that I just couldn't squeeze in, which includes a paper by Verdun et al., which I did quote from, but didn't have a chance to discuss. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that you stay well.
Thank you, David, for an absolutely fascinating and topical talk. Robert, you have been looking to see if anyone had questions on the Q&A window. Please go ahead if there was anything there.
There aren't any at the moment, but I guess that's a good time to invite people to enter questions in the Q&A window.
Sure. And I can ask a couple of things while other people might be putting something there, if that's okay, David?
Sure.
So you talked about basically t-tests, K or t-samples, K individuals per sample. And I didn't get a sense as to whether anyone has looked at kind of what's the optimal way to partition N in that fashion. Do you know if?
Yeah, so a lot of the literature, both classically in group testing, is of that nature, and you definitely had stuff like this done even as long ago as the 60s and 70s in the stat literature. Here, there's also been a lot of these medRxiv papers where people have checked that out. Chris Bilder and the University of Nebraska team decided that 5 is good for them, but based on an assumed prevalence. And in all of these things, you assume the prevalence of the disease and you get an optimal group size. It's not that it's, absolutely necessary that prevalence be the one that's in effect, but you do fewer tests than at any other group size, provided you do that. You might have to do more tests in the end if you do something suboptimal.
Another question just regarding the technical details. How did the FDA come up with their particular threshold? Did they kind of do lab experiments where they in some way knew how many particles were in the test?
So I showed you the plot that was taken from the Rambam Technion paper where they actually showed you the fluorescence curves as for every patient that they had in the first week of March. And so there you see both the positive and negative cases. And so what you would hope that the FDA had done is that they would take negative cases and they would choose the threshold to be above where the fluorescent curve for negative cases go, but also below where the fluorescence curve for positive cases go. And the Rambam Technion plot that I showed demonstrates that very clearly, that none, there were some that came close, but like none of the negative samples at the Technion came up to fluorescence of 300 by cycle 40. And so the FDA did its job well. They were not going to call a false alarm, and they didn't. So and that's pretty striking, because like FDA and is doing something in the US, and here's this, you know, independent replication using completely unrelated equipment and so on and so forth, and you can see that the FDA's threshold worked. So I could show that plot again if it would help. I'd have to share screen again.
Oh, you know what? That's okay. I remember it was pretty clear cut.
Yeah.
The separation in those
Yeah.
those particular two sets of individuals.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, when thinking about your talk and reading that the paper by Dorfman, and then just thinking about the magnitude of the problem, you know, anything that can be done in terms of making the process is more efficient would be dramatic. Even if we were able to divide the number of tests by say 10, that's still a lot of tests, for example, in the United States, if we want to get to universal testing.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense in California as to the level of testing and kind of plans to increase that?
Yeah, it seems that our prevalence is somewhat low compared to, say, New York, of course. But we don't actually know unless we do the testing. So there's a little chicken and egg thing here, is that with limited tests, you really are afraid to use the tests except on people who have symptoms. And then that means you have a really bad sample selection problem. So, you know, there's been some controversy out here of what's the actual prevalence rate. And there was you know, there's been a variety of different opinions about that.
Right. Robert, I'll pass to you because I see some activity in the chat window.
Yep, there's quite a few now. I think I'll start with one from that I think came in first from Richard Lockhart. He says, each PCR round is effectively doubling. You spoke of factors of 10 in the concentrations between consecutive curves on your first PCR plot, but that doesn't feel like it matches doubling at each iteration. Maybe I missed something, question mark.
Yeah,
But,
no, you're totally right. And if the simple story that I told you were, you know, mathematically precise, that would be right. Like each round would just be literally exactly doubling. But apparently that's not the case. And so what you see is something that it's qualitatively correct. You know, it's not like things are going by a factor of 8 every iteration, and it's not like things are going by a factor of 1.25, but you see some deviation.
thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit and merge a couple of questions as we go too. Here's a question. Are the people requiring fewer cycles for detection of the disease showing more symptoms or getting sicker?
Yeah, they have a higher viral load. So there's just more virus particles in a given amount of blood. And I had some, you know, plots that I might have shown. So as a function of the course of your infection, you have different amounts of virus in your blood. And so maybe, you know, a week after your infection, you're at some kind of a peak of virus in the blood, and then it drops off. So if you happen to be testing someone who was just infected yesterday, there may not be very much virus yet. And if you test someone who was infected 20 days ago, there also may not be that much virus left. But you know, 7 days ago, there'll be a lot of virus. And so we saw in the plot that I presented that you get to these different positions in cycle space, and that's all just based on the virus numbers. Now, as part of your question, you implied that having more virus makes you sicker. So the thing is that as far as we know, you could be asymptomatic and have actually quite a lot of virus and shed a lot of virus. And so you could be very infectious and actually not feeling very sick. So the short answer is you definitely have more virus. You may not feel sick, even if you have a lot of virus. That's part of what this disease is all about.
Okay, how are we for time, Bruce? I'll keep going.
Sorry, yeah, the meeting was originally scheduled for an hour and a half, which would be 15 minutes from now. I just added an additional 15 minutes. So I don't think we're going to have an issue. We can, as long as David's willing to continue fielding questions.
Sounds good. Okay, so I have there are a few. They're rolling in now. I'm still going to work my way back from the earlier ones to some extent. So I'm trying to think of whether no, I'll just ask them separately. How sensitive are these group testing results if the false positive rate is higher than the assumed value?
Well, a lot of it doesn't really depend on, I mean, what happens is that the false positive rate and the misdetection rate of the basic test then have to be translated into the false positive rate and the misdetection rate of the inferred status. So you're not learning about it, you're not making a direct measurement on any one patient's status. You're making an inference about their status, and then that inference has its own false alarm and misdetection. And so so first of all, you have to propagate that through, and you know there are techniques to do that. Depends on the method, depends on different things. So that's the first issue. The second issue is the assumed prevalence matters for some of these methods, so that if the prevalence is way higher than 20%, the benefit of doing this will really erode. So there's an element which I didn't speak about, which is you could start with a one round all at once method, but then by internal diagnosis, you could see that, oh my goodness, we have like way more infected people in this batch. And so you could become a two-round method if your ambition to be one round all at once was frustrated. You could fall back. And so you could use one of these high-tech methods based on combinatorial group testing inspiration or compressed sensing methods. And you could just use that as a would-be first round that ends up being, just one of several rounds. So so if the prevalence is higher than you expected in the sample, there'll be a little delay because you'll have to test a second tray of assays. But That's the only problem there. Now, if the test, you have some desired false alarm rate of the inference, as opposed to the composed, as opposed to the individual test of the pool. And so, as we saw, Paul Romer wants a false alarm rate of like at most 20% or something, and misdetection rate of at most 20%. So then, that's what you have statisticians for, is to figure out if the inferences obey that basic design constraint. I don't think that the doctors and engineering teams who are working on this have really drilled down into that issue, like how to run a national effort and monitor these things very carefully and run them very smoothly, where you're maintaining the integrity of a set of design specs. I think the literature today is just more like, we could do this, look, we did it on some patients, we can do it, let's do it. I don't know if I've answered the question, but those were some thoughts that came to mind.
So that actually you covered, I think, that question and a couple of others that are in the list, which is good. So there's a couple of questions that I'm going to link together. One is whether there are any approaches which attempt to incorporate a prior belief of infection for different individuals. And the sort of one that I think is a follow-up to that is, can it be useful to know that some pools might include individuals who've had contact with infected people? So is there any way to incorporate prior information about the pool members into?
Yeah, I mean, from the generalized, I mean, we all understand that you can do generalized linear modeling where you put, you do max a posteriori. There's a prior belief that you have on the individual betas in a standard generalized linear model, right? So if you just did that, sort of Bayesian GLM, then here beta becomes the patient viral load, and you just take your prior belief on that and put it in there. So that of course we all know that if you're Bayesian, you can outperform anybody else if you have the right prior. So if you develop a lot of patient history and you have a lot of information about a variety of patients and how they turned out, you might go much farther than we're saying here. Here we're not doing that. We're not using any, it's completely agnostic about the individual patients. And so there's definitely, so it's like here you could think of it as you want to be Bayesian and have a sparsity prior, sparse effect prior for, because you're assuming prevalence is relatively low. And so you want to hybridize two different kinds of prior together, but Bayesians know how to do that.
Okay, I am just all right. Maybe one or two more. One more, maybe. So what? Someone was skimming the Israel paper, and it looks like they had a 10% false positive rate. And so the question, doesn't this lead to far more false positives than true cases? And is that not a problem with large-scale screening of the general population?
Oh, but you know, if you could take all your positives and pool them and do another test on those guys, and then identify, you know, so let's imagine that you know, you have a follow-up round where all the positives get grouped together, and now you want to be super careful. So, you know, you still do pooling, but with like, you know, much more exacting, so on and so forth. And you still do a very limited number of tests. You're still way ahead. And in this way, by doing the multiple rounds, you know, recouped whatever false alarm or misdetection probabilities that you were worried about. Again, that's an issue of like controlling the integrity of a whole process. I don't think an individual researcher in medRxiv is, you know, designing like a nationwide health system and having repêchage trials in which they, you know, go and they just validate the integrity of what the, you know, the system is producing. But definitely the, you know, people who are administering a national system like that are going to put in repêchage, no question.
All right. One or two more. Yeah, we're close to 4:30. Someone was asking how the threshold for positivity is determined for the rapid test kits.
I mean, how did FDA come up with 300? Well, I haven't seen their data, and they don't, you know, I mean, I think the work was actually done at CDC, and FDA, you know, reviewed it. What did CDC do? I have not interviewed them. Based on the data that were published by the Rambam Technion team, I think it looks to me that if you take you know, a large sample of true negatives, you're just not going to see a fluorescent signal going above 300 at any time up until 40 cycles. And I mean, one way to think of it is that's probably something that doesn't really depend on what virus we're talking about. Like anytime we use this technology, we have a probe and we're trying to amplify, and you know, they must have done many hundreds of thousands of these things again and again across different viruses. I would be surprised that they don't have a great deal of accumulated wisdom because of that. So the null case, I think it's easy to set the threshold to just be high enough that that you're not going to see false alarms.
Okay, thank you. I think I will, there's two questions that are sort of related and having to do with the difference between what you've primarily been discussing, which is tests for viral load, and the seroconversion test for immunity, and whether any of this would apply in that latter case, or is that just such a different setting, different technology?
Well, I did show you that, you know, in HIV antibody testing, pooling was done in the early days when, you know, a test had first come online, and there was a clamor of many affected individuals who wanted to know if they had antibodies and all of that. So the exact same issues came up in those days, and in the paper from the Harvard Public School of Health team that I showed you, they showed you can pool. You can definitely pool antibodies, no question. You have the same dilution concerns, namely, if you spread yourself too thin in the pooling, you may get false negative results that would make it, you know, not advisable. But apparently it's it's something that's been done many times. In fact, I would say in antibody testing, it's, you know, that was Dorfman's original setting, I believe.
So Robert, I think we're an hour and a half in now in a talk that David was only really obligated and probably anticipating giving us an hour. So I think perhaps I'll cut off the questions at this point. I'd like to kind of close. And David, thank you very much for joining us today, giving us what is an absolutely fascinating perspective on a problem that's likely on just about everybody's mind. So I think, you know, the timing of this was absolutely fantastic. So again, thank you very much. And I'm sure that I hear applause from many quarters in the country. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I just like we're thanking healthcare workers, I think we need to thank the research workers who've done all this spectacular work that I've been reporting on. I'm just, you know, really in awe of the effort and dedication that people have done so quickly and posted on medRxiv. It's a real game changer.
Thank you very much. And to you and everyone else, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and bye-bye.